Now, the high-tech solution, Florida is deploying robotic rabbits to help capture invasive Burmese pythons in the Everglades. These decoy bunnies are solar-powered, remote-controlled, and complete with cameras, heat signatures, and actual marsh rabbit scent.
Dawn breaks over the Everglades the same way it has for thousands of years, a flat sheet of gold light rolling across sawgrass and still water, 1.5 million acres of wetland that almost no human being will ever walk through. It looks peaceful, it looks untouched, but hidden inside that beauty, tucked behind wire pens, scattered through the deepest, wettest corners of the marsh, sat something that had no business existing in a swamp. Hundreds of small machines built to look, feel, and smell exactly like a living animal. Robotic rabbits, machines that breathed out heat, machines that leaked the scent of fur and blood, machines that twitched their ears like something with a heartbeat. The state of Florida spent millions of dollars building them for a single purpose: to trick the most dangerous predator hiding in the sawgrass into revealing itself. And for 2 days, the plan worked better than anyone dared hope. Then came the third day. And something came out of the water toward those decoys that no engineer, no biologist, and no wildlife agency had planned for. What started as a clever trap turned into a disaster nobody could have written on purpose, and then, almost impossibly, into a discovery nobody could have predicted either. To understand why the state of Florida ever agreed to drop an army of fake rabbits into a swamp, you first have to understand what has been quietly happening underneath that gorgeous golden surface for the last 3 decades. The Everglades is one of the most damaged ecosystems left in North America, and the thing tearing it apart isn't runoff or development or a changing climate. It's a snake. The Burmese python, a constrictor that evolved half a world away in the jungles of Southeast Asia, now spreads across the Florida wetlands as if it had always belonged there. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. This wasn't an act of nature. Florida didn't get invaded. Florida invited the invasion in. Rewind to the exotic pet boom of the 1980s and 90s. Baby pythons were sold in Florida pet stores as novelties, small enough to coil around a child's wrist, marketed as an easy, exotic pet. Nobody selling them seemed to mention what came next. Those hatchlings didn't stay small. Within a handful of years, many of them stretched out to 15, even 20 feet long enough, strong enough, to overpower a full-grown deer or lock a death grip on an alligator. Owners who had pictured a curious little snake in a terrarium suddenly found themselves staring at a monster too large for any home. So they did what people quietly do when they're in over their heads. They drove out to a canal, or a drainage ditch, or the edge of the swamp, and let go. Then, in 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida with catastrophic force, and among the buildings it flattened were reptile breeding facilities holding God knows how many snakes. The storm ripped the doors open. Nobody counted how many pythons slid out into the wild that day, but biologists agree on this much: that storm didn't just destroy buildings, it seeded an empire. For a hungry, adaptable predator, the Everglades wasn't just survivable. It was paradise: year-round warmth, endless water, and prey animals that had spent millions of years evolving defenses against bobcats and alligators, but never against this. A python could lay up to 100 eggs in a single clutch, and with no natural predator to check its numbers, that population didn't just grow, it detonated. Today, biologists estimate that tens of thousands of pythons, quite possibly hundreds of thousands, are hidden in that sawgrass right now, coiled and waiting, invisible to nearly everyone who drives past on the highway. And what they've done to the food web underneath them is nothing short of alarming. In regions where pythons took hold, raccoons didn't just decline. Opossums didn't just decline. Marsh rabbits didn't just decline. Their populations collapsed, drops of over 90% in some survey areas, numbers so severe that researchers initially assumed their equipment was broken. One python was found with an entire adult deer inside its body, its skin stretched grotesquely thin around a meal that should have been physically impossible to swallow. Another was filmed locked in a death spiral with an alligator, a fight so brutal that neither predator walked away. Both animals died tangled together in the mud. And the damage doesn't stop there, it ripples outward. Fewer small mammals means less food for the hawks and owls that used to hunt above the grass. Fewer scavengers means carcasses linger in the shallow water instead of being cleaned up, and the chemistry of the soil itself begins to shift under the weight of decay. An entire wetland, one of the most unique ecosystems on the planet, was quietly coming apart. And the animal pulling every thread loose had arrived here in the pocket of a child 30 years earlier. So Florida declared war, and its first weapon was people. In 2013, the state launched the Python Challenge, a public hunt with prize money and national headlines, an open invitation for anyone brave, foolish, or bored enough to wade into snake-infested water at night with a flashlight and a machete. Hundreds of hunters answered the call. Weeks of searching through heat, mud, and mosquitoes followed. And when it was all tallied up, the grand total of pythons removed from the wild was 68. Out of a population that may run into six figures, it made for a great news story. It solved almost nothing. So Florida got more serious. The state created the Python Elimination Program, paying licensed contractors by the hour, plus bonuses per snake, to patrol the levees after dark. It helped, a little, but the math stayed brutal. For every python a hunter dragged out of the canal, it felt like two more had already slipped in behind them. Researchers even tried something colder and more clever, strapping radio transmitters to female pythons and releasing them back into the wild, betting that these so-called Judas snakes would lead hunters straight to breeding aggregations. It worked. A little. It still wasn't nearly enough. The Everglades was simply too vast, too wet, too tangled for a handful of human trackers to cover. That's when Florida turned to a hunter with a far older set of instincts: dogs. Specially trained detection dogs were sent into the marsh to do something no human nose or human eye could manage: track the faint, musky scent trail a python leaves behind in the sawdust and mud, a smell that can linger long after the snake itself has moved on. And the results came almost immediately. In their very first months in the field, the dogs sniffed out large pythons that human crews had walked directly past for weeks. Snakes hiding in plain sight, invisible to the eye but unmistakable to a trained nose. A dog's whole body would go rigid, tail locked stiff, and a handler's flashlight would sweep across the water to reveal the slow, unmistakable ripple of scales that a dozen human search parties had missed entirely. The dogs worked in cooling vests to survive the suffocating heat, wearing protective boots against blades of razor-edged sawgrass, all while sharing that same water with alligators and venomous cottonmouths at every step. It was extraordinary work. But there was a problem nobody wanted to say out loud: scale. A handful of dog teams, however brilliant, were being asked to search 1.5 million acres of 100-degree wetland. To truly cover that ground, Florida would have needed hundreds of dog teams, a price tag running into the tens of millions of dollars. The dogs proved the method could work. They couldn't be the whole answer, but they proved something far more valuable than a single body count. They proved that scent, not sight, not sound, but smell, was the key that could pull a python out of hiding, and that idea sent Florida's scientists down a much darker road. They started with live bait, actual marsh rabbits, the python's favorite meal, placed inside secure enclosures along known snake corridors. The rabbits were physically protected from harm, but they were unmistakably terrified, and that fear did precisely what the researchers were hoping for. Within a matter of weeks, pythons began emerging from the sawgrass one after another, drawn straight toward the enclosures. The theory was proven beyond doubt. Live prey worked, but footage of trembling, panicked rabbits surrounded by giant constrictors sparked immediate, furious backlash from animal welfare organizations across the country. Under that public pressure, the live bait trials were shut down almost as fast as they'd begun. The scientists had their answer, and no legal way to use it. So they made a decision that sounds like it belongs in a science fiction script, not a state wildlife program. If they couldn't use a real rabbit, they would build one. The project was named Robo Rabbit, and every single unit was a genuine feat of engineering. Weatherproof synthetic fur stretched over a body holding an internal heating element tuned to mimic a living rabbit's body temperature of roughly 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Tiny scent emitters that released a chemical compound engineered to smell exactly like rabbit musk, drifting outward on the swamp breeze. Some units even had small motors that twitched the ears and flicked the nose, just enough movement to sell the illusion. Hidden inside each decoy sat a motion-triggered camera and a wireless transmitter, the whole system running on small solar panels, so it could stay powered in the field for weeks at a time without anyone touching it. Each robotic rabbit cost close to $4,000 to build. Florida deployed roughly 120 of them, anchored inside protective enclosures scattered across the worst python hotspots the state could identify. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: lure the snakes into monitored zones, then send in recovery teams to remove them for good. Nobody knew, when the first unit powered on, whether any of it would actually work. The first 2 days were a stunning, almost unbelievable success. Alerts began pinging in almost immediately. Field cameras captured extraordinary footage: massive pythons, some stretching past 15 feet, gliding directly toward the decoys, tongues flicking as they tasted the heat and the scent in the air. Then they struck, coiling around the fake rabbits exactly as they would around a real one, while recovery teams closed in and physically hauled the snakes out of the water. Snake after snake after snake. The machines were doing precisely what they had been built to do, and then came day 3. An alert fired from a decoy stationed near a deep-water canal, and the biologist monitoring the live feed braced for another python capture. Instead, the camera showed something else entirely: a dark, log-shaped mass cutting fast through the water, a 12-foot alligator. And this alligator wasn't confused by the mechanical rabbit in front of it. It was drawn in by the exact same signals the pythons had been chasing: the heat, the scent, the illusion of an easy, struggling meal. In one violent eruption of mud and water, it crushed a $4,000 machine in a single bite, leaving nothing behind but shredded synthetic fur drifting on the surface. The robots, it turned out, weren't just luring pythons. They were the perfect bait for anything in that swamp with teeth. And here's the detail nobody on the engineering team had thought all the way through. Pythons and alligators are ancient rivals, 2 apex predators competing for the exact same territory and the exact same prey inside the exact same wetland. Florida had just scattered 120 warm, twitching dinner bells directly across the shared hunting grounds of 2 competing predators, and the signal those machines sent out traveled through the marsh in every direction at once. What happened next was almost impossible to believe. The alligators learned. They began actively patrolling toward the decoys, recognizing the glowing heat signatures as an easy free meal, dragging pen after pen under the surface and crushing dozens of machines one after another. And the pythons, sensing that alligators were suddenly clustering thick around every trap, did exactly the one thing the researchers had prayed they wouldn't. They started avoiding the enclosures entirely, melting back into the deep sawgrass, gone. The whole operation appeared to be collapsing in real time. Expensive machines were being shredded in the canals. The snake alerts had gone completely silent. By every visible measure available at the time, the Robotic Rabbit program looked like an extremely costly, very public failure. But those broken machines had been hiding something the entire time. A young data analyst working with the team noticed something the rest of the group had overlooked in the wreckage. The robots hadn't only ever been decoys, they had been spies. Long before every alligator strike, before every ignored trap sat silent for days, each unit's motion sensor and thermal camera had quietly been recording everything that moved through its field of view. Not just the successful python captures. Every single pass, every hesitation, every direction of travel, every time of day, every shift in temperature. When the team pulled the recordings from all 120 units, including, crucially, the ones the snakes had never even approached, a pattern surfaced out of the swamp that no human researcher had ever documented. The pythons weren't moving at random across 1.5 million acres of wetland. They were following routes. Specific, repeated corridors carved through the water and the grass, hidden highways the snakes used again and again to travel between hunting grounds. And the alligators, it turned out, were using many of the same roads. This is where the story stops sounding like a wildlife program and starts sounding like something out of a science fiction film. Researchers took every scrap of that footage, every twitch, every failed hunt, every crushed decoy, and fed the entire dataset into a machine learning system, hunting for patterns invisible to the human eye, and the system found one. It began predicting not just where pythons were likely to be, but when they would be there, because the model had effectively learned what the pythons themselves were afraid of: The snakes were adjusting their movements to avoid their single greatest threat in that ecosystem, the alligators. The robots hadn't just captured a handful of individual snakes. Almost by accident, they had mapped the python's entire hidden schedule, their routes, their timing, even the predator they were quietly trying to outmaneuver. Armed with that map, Florida's hunters abandoned the old strategy overnight. No more waiting beside a static decoy, hoping a snake might happen by. Now teams used the model's predictions to move first, intercepting pythons directly on the secret corridors they used when they believed no one was watching. The results were staggering. Hunters stopped finding pythons one at a time and started finding them in clusters. By tracking the movement of large, mature females along those newly mapped corridors, the model accomplished something every previous program in over a decade had failed to do. It led researchers directly to active breeding grounds, massive nesting sites buried so deep in the sawgrass and standing water that no human search team would likely have stumbled onto them in 100 years of searching. Dozens of females coiled together in the mud, thousands upon thousands of eggs in a single location, an entire future generation of the invasion sitting exposed and waiting to hatch. In a single month working from that data, hunters removed more invasive pythons than an entire year of the earlier bounty programs combined. Every single failure along the way, every crushed robot, every alligator ambush, every silent week with no alerts at all, had, without anyone realizing it in the moment, been building the exact dataset needed to finally turn the tide. The robotic rabbits, even as they were torn apart one by one in the jaws of the swamp, had quietly done something none of Florida's earlier programs ever managed. They didn't just help fight the python invasion, they rewrote the entire strategy for fighting it. So here's the question worth sitting with. Did Florida's strange, expensive gamble accidentally train a smarter, harder-to-find generation of python-y, one that has now learned to read the very traps built to catch it? Or did the state just stumble onto the one idea that could finally turn this invasion around? What would you try next, if you were the one standing at the edge of that swamp with the data in your hands?